hide themselves in a dark room with the door shut and experience the fright. Or I remember, you know the nasty sensation you get with a plaster wall on a cold day, running your fingernails up it. I know as children, we used to do this. Just to thrill ourselves with how horrible it was. I remember too, in school, when I was a kid, we used to have wooden pens that we wrote with, and we always used to chew them. Some people chewed the ends of their pens till they were like wooden brushes. So one day they ordered that a jar of bitter aloes would be deposited on every teacher's desk, and anybody seen chewing their pen would have it dipped in the bitter aloes. Everybody instantly chewed their pens to get it dipped in the bitter aloes, which tasted absolutely horrible, but was wonderful. And we all sucked on the bitter aloes and acquired a taste for it in about 3 minutes. And this is like children. Children do this kind of thing. Perhaps because they're nearer to the source of what I'm talking about. But now, let's go on to the next important step. All I'm suggesting is that thus far I have created a fantasy that this is not the way the world is, but is a purely artistic idea of what it might be like. Now, when we've created such an idea, there are certain ways in which we can criticize it. We can criticize a work of art. Not on the grounds of, is this conception true or not true, but is it a good work of art or not? And therefore, the criticism I want to apply to this is based on aesthetic grounds, purely. And I think the aesthetic criterion I'm going to apply first is that of simplicity. This is purely an aesthetic criterion, because there's something that appeals to us, I don't know why, but it does, about achieving some sort of result by the simplest possible way, without, as it were, making any unnecessary detour. This is one of the great criteria of a work of art. I don't know quite why, but let's take a comparison between the conception of the solar system of Ptolemy and that of Copernicus. The Ptolemaic solar system is where everything revolves around the Earth. And in this system, some of the planets have to do something rather complicated. In order to describe the movement of the planets as all going around the Earth, some of the planets have to do things like this. They have to weave back on their own paths. But if you take the sun as the center, nothing has to weave back on its own path. It keeps moving elliptically around the sun in the same direction. In other words, Copernicus's solar system is simpler than Ptolemy's. Today we say Copernicus was right and Ptolemy was wrong. It isn't quite correct to say that. Copernicus was simpler. And science has in it an aesthetic criterion, that those explanations which are simpler are accepted rather than those which are more complicated. Imagine for a moment you've got a box with 2 holes in it, and out of these 2 holes come each a piece of string. You can never get inside this box, but when you pull the piece of string on the right, the piece of string on the left goes into the box. And when you pull the piece of string on the left, the piece of string on the right goes into the box. Now, what inside the box would account for this phenomenon? You see? You can imagine all kinds of pulley wheels and gadgets inside the box that would give this result. But the simplest thing you can imagine is that the piece of string goes simply in at one hole and out at the other. That would explain it. So the scientist always chooses the simplest solution that will answer whatever he has. So if we apply this criterion to what I'm talking about, that supposing we are all a drama, that there is within us a sort of second self that is pretending to be our ordinary everyday self and is scaring itself and enjoying itself with this pretense. On these sort of aesthetic grounds, could some criticism be applied to what I'm saying? Well, I think it could. I've taken a step in inventing this idea which is perhaps unnecessary. And that is the step of making a difference between an experiencer and an experience. Also, my fantasy has a complication of assuming something rather supernatural. In other words, it's a little bit of a strain upon one's credulity to believe that each one of us is really, as it were, God in disguise. How can this be demonstrated? How can it be shown? That's a little awkward. Could the theory be simplified? Could it be made easier than that? After all, what am I trying to prove? What I'm trying to prove, or what my fantasy was intended, the problem it was intended to deal with, is the conflict which we ordinarily feel between ourselves and what we experience. This is the problem of pain. Life hurts. It hurts me. And I feel different from it. How am I going to justify it? So the way in which I tried to solve this problem was by saying I have another deeper self than the one I'm ordinarily aware of. And that deeper self wants everything that happens and is really in control of it. That was the solution. Now then, I criticize the solution and say it may have in it an unnecessary step. The unnecessary step of a self different from, standing away from, and observing what actually happens and goes on. Now look, in our ordinary everyday awareness, yes, we all are a self which observes what goes on and feels different from it and criticizes it. We like it or we don't like it. Now, what my theory first assumed was a deeper self than our ordinary one, which actually digs everything that happens. It is no longer in a position of either liking it or not liking it, but accepts all of it. But now we can see that there's another possible solution which achieves the same result. That there isn't any self which observes what happens, different from it. That would achieve the same result as the self which accepts everything. You see what I mean? Let me go over this again, because this is an absolutely crucial point. You can imagine yourself as a subject as an ego to which everything happens, and you can accept it or reject it. You like it, you don't like it. And so you feel it's a problem. First idea. Second idea, you can imagine that you're a self deeper than the ego, a kind of Atman, Brahma in Hindu philosophy, which actually is willing the whole thing. This is a little bit of a stress on our credulity. Third possibility, though, which comes out, let's not posit at all a self on the one hand and experiences on the other, so that there's a problem. Do I like it or don't I like it? Do I accept it or don't I accept it? But let's suppose that we've introduced a problem where no problem exists. It isn't a question of whether life experience is something that we're going to accept or reject. Supposing it's what we are, and no question arises of accepting or rejecting it, isn't this then a simpler description than the one I have tried to describe? What we would have then to recover from we ordinarily experience ourselves as an ego, a mind, a center of consciousness confronted with the problems of life, and absolutely, really, basically unable to deal with them. We can find an out from that by the fantasy that we're really capable of dealing with them, that we're omnipotent, but that we've put ourselves in this position for fun. But if that solution is, aesthetically speaking, too complicated, there is a simpler solution, aesthetically. And that is that the initial division of ourselves from what we're experiencing was an unnecessary step. Now we know physically that everything that we experience is a state of our own nervous system. That the division between the subject and the object, the self and the world, is quite conventional. At this moment, you can see me standing against the black curtain here with these flowers behind me, and you can see the backs of the heads of the people sitting immediately in front of you. And you normally assume all that is not you. It's somebody, something else. But as a matter of fact, the whole thing that you're looking at is deep inside you. It's a state of your nervous system. Now, is there somebody observing what's happening in your nervous system? Is there somebody watching what you see with your eyes? No. What you're looking at is you. As your eyes are open now, resting upon this scene, you are observing the flesh and blood of yourself. That's it. And there's no you observing it. This pattern of lights and colors and shapes is the middle of your brain. That's how the middle of your brain feels, how you feel. Not only through the sense of sight, but through all your fingertips, the drums of your ears, the taste buds in your mouth and your nose. All they're conveying to you of the external world is you. Now, if we appreciate what this involves, this is quite a shock. Let's go back. What did we start? What was the problem we started with? The problem we started was this. How can I reconcile myself to life as it actually is? How can I make up a theory to try and show that in some way that what happens is what I want? To try and solve this problem, we invented a second self underneath our ordinary self. Who wants all this? Who is one with it? Now I've simplified it. I think I've shown we don't need that hypothesis of a second self underneath our first self. That's unnecessary. What we discover is that the world we know and the world we say we suffer is ourselves anyway. There actually isn't a situation in which the hard facts of life impinge on and hit a person who is separate from them. We think of life as an encounter between a subject and an object, as if these two creatures, the subject and the object, came from the opposite ends of God only knows where and met each other, and bang, they have an encounter. Whereas if we describe human life in the simplest possible way, without calling in any souls and spooks and supernatural beliefs, what we find out is quite the contrary. That experience is not an encounter. It is not an I meeting with an it or a thou. Because when I look at you, I'm also looking at myself. These are inseparable. Yes, you exist in your own right. But when you look at me and I look at you, what we are seeing is ourselves. We're seeing our own nervous system. The more we know of others, the more we know of ourselves. There isn't any gap. So that you could say that actually you are willing, this is putting it in sort of picturesque language, you are willing everything that happens to you. When you don't like it, you're willing you don't like. When you do like it, you're willing you do like. And the people who have the sort of experience that Richard Buck was describing here, the cosmic consciousness or whatever, are those who wake up to this fact. That you never at any time experience anything which you don't completely will, however horrible. Now that's, as it were, a sort of report that comes out of a state of consciousness that is not familiar to us. But it happens to very many people. Not necessarily people who are great saints and sages who've practiced yoga and meditation disciplines for many, many years. This is an experience which happens to very ordinary people, to children, to people having their teeth extracted because they had anesthesia or something like that. There are all kinds of ways in which this may be seen. And we don't know the laws, if any, which govern how it happens. The sudden recognition, in other words, that the world that is other than yourself, that is outside you, that is not under your ordinary control, that hurts you and fights you, is deep down a hidden aspect of yourself, the unknown other that is you. If we could believe that, if we could really believe it and know it, obviously nothing could have any terrors for us. We could know that however far we went into pain, grief, anything, it would be simply discovering ourselves in a hidden form. Now, first of all, my point is not to say to you, we can prove that this is so. My point, first of all, is imagine this as an answer. And can you think of a better one? Supposing, on the other hand, you want to be completely hard-boiled, that we could invent a cosmology other than joyous. We could think of the disastrous cosmology. What kind of a theory of the universe could we invent that would be as nasty as possible? And we would very quickly find that if we invented it, it wouldn't work. In other words, that all would have ceased to exist long ago. Think of the maximum nasty cosmology, and it would have collapsed. Think of the middling cosmology, that is so, you know, more or less works. It would have collapsed too. You have to think of something like this, for one that still does, actually goes on. And this is not only a work of fantasy that invents this, but also, in addition to this, there are again and again the people who experience this as being the actual state of affairs, in one way or another. And I often think of a poem of G.K. Chesterton's that I read years and years ago, called The Song of the Children. It is a sort of fantasy about Jesus and his relation to the adults on the one hand, which was rather stuffy, and his relation to the children on the other. And he says he taught them, the adults, laws and watchwords, to preach and struggle and prey. But he taught us, deep in the hayfield, the games that the angels play. And had he stayed here forever, their world would be wise as ours. And the king be cutting capers, and the priest be picking flowers. And I feel that this is the spirit which our present day world needs more than anything else. To see that what is truly important in life is what is frivolous. To see that it doesn't matter two hoots that we achieve a certain success, that we win a certain game, that we live longer than we might live otherwise. What matters more than anything else is that the king be cutting capers and the priest be picking flowers. In other words, that we become capable of touching each other, of loving each other, of recognizing in every other, in the strangeness and threat that we feel sometimes when we look into another person's eyes and feel, how we turn away. You look in the subway at the person sitting opposite you, and you meet their eyes for a moment and then turn off. Why? What are we afraid of? The thing that you're afraid of in the other is you. Isn't it possible? Isn't it really possible that this stop? That the fear of looking at the other, touching the other, of recognizing yourself in the other, be overcome. And that we understand that what otherness means. On the surface, the other is always the one with whom we're in contest. When we look in the other person's eyes, you've all played this game. Can I look longer until he looks away? Who's going to win? What's the relationship between husband and wife? Mostly competition. Always the relationship between self and other is a contest. But what I mean by the joyous cosmology is seeing that all contests are faked, that it's a let's pretend battle, because there really is no self and no other. And so that when you feel the strangeness of another person, the weird unfamiliarity when you look into their eyes and feel embarrassed and peculiar and maybe threatened, what you're really feeling is your own life. And you're just thrilling yourself with the other person by climbing up behind yourself and saying, boom! But we could wake up and we could look and enjoy it. So shall we have about 5 or 10 minutes intermission? And then if you want to stay to ask questions, I'll be happy to try and discuss.
Everything we experience and see is ourselves, or we are it. I don't see that explains why it is that we're not ordinarily aware of this, the way you're first saying.
Did you all hear the question? It's a very good question. It brings up a crucial difference between the two alternatives that I presented. One, that behind our ordinary everyday self there is a hidden self, which is playing the limitations and problems of our everyday life as a hide-and-seek game. And this seems, to the questioner, to be a better explanation of the difficulty than the second position, which is not that there is a self behind the self that has the experiences of the world, but that there is no difference between the self and the experiences of the world. Then she is asking, why don't we know that this is so? You see, when we explain or answer the question why, we always cheat. When, for example, you ask, of a scientist, why do certain things happen? What he tells you is how they happen. In other words, when he gives you the causes of certain events, all he does is to describe the same events in greater detail and calls this why it happens. It's only how it happens. So you're in a little bit cheated if you thought it was why. So in the same way, if, in other words, we are really what we experience, but we think we're different, and we say, why does this happen? Why don't we know? I can tell you how it happens, but I can't tell you why. How it happens, yes, that's simple. Because when we are little children, our sisters, cousins, aunts, parents, teachers, everybody tells us who we are. They give us a definition of what it is to be a human being. And this definition is that you are a knower who confronts the known. You are a controller. You are an agent behind acts. That's the definition of you. We're all taught this. And even if it ain't necessarily so, that's what we believe and that's what we feel. So this is why, this is not so much why, but how we come to feel divided from our experience of the world. I could go on to say how this began to happen. It was a sort of mistaken interpretation of human experience, which occurred a long time ago and grew into a habit. It's caused a lot of damage, just in the same way as a single tiny pebble may be set rolling and start an avalanche. Nobody could have foreseen that.